Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The promoter for former WBO champion Joseph Parker, he's confident to win over Dillian Whyte, could see the New Zealander sitting pretty, as he puts it, for a rematch with Anthony Joshua in 2019. Duco boss David Higgins, he made the comments during a live broadcast of a fight card held in New Zealand, which featured Junior Farr in the main event. Higgins also made some very interesting comments about Parker and what he will do to Dillian Whyte and how he's shaping up in camp physically. So I'll also get to some other news in this video in relation to the Parker-Whyte fight. Specifically, the WBO will not be making it any sort of final eliminator, so more on that later. Buckle in. Let's go. David Higgins, he stated on Sky Sports New Zealand that Joseph Parker, that version that fought Anthony Joshua, will beat Dillian Whyte. That he has no doubt of, and that Parker, he needed to look good and he needed a knockout. He then went on to qualify that by saying it had been 18 months since Parker had a knockout, and a KO win, it would be good for him. He said Joseph Parker has earned a lot of respect in the UK. And the winner of this Parker-Whyte fight probably goes to number 1 in the WBO. Remember, it's number 2 versus number 6. But the sort of qualifier to that is Alexander Povetkin. He is expected to take his mandatory fight in the WBA. Currently, he's also number 1 in the WBO. So if he goes, then obviously the top slot is vacant. So Higgins, he added, a win could see Parker sitting pretty for a rematch with Joshua. And it could be set for October next year. And it could be a Wembley fight. He also weighed in on the possible winner of a Joshua vs Deontay Wilder fight, saying that if Joshua fights the way that he did against Parker with absolute discipline for 12 rounds, then he thinks Joshua will beat Wilder. But it has to be that sort of fight, because if Joshua gets sloppy, Deontay Wilder could knock him out. And asked about Parker coming through that loss to Joshua in a psychological sense, Higgins said he'd come through it psychologically very well. That in fact Parker, he was very hungry and had entered camp for Dillian Whyte in much better condition physically than he had for the Joshua fight. And that 5 weeks out from fight night, Parker is already in the same condition that he was in on fight night for the Joshua fight. And that come fight night on July 28th against Whyte, Joseph Parker will be, quote, in formidable shape. So there's quite a bit to unpack there from David Higgins' statements on New Zealand television. So first, I'm sure that the assertion that the version of Joseph Parker that fought Anthony Joshua will beat Dillian Whyte on July 28th, that's really going to annoy some people and get up their noses. Sure, Parker survived against Joshua, whereas Whyte did not. But we have to acknowledge they were two different types of fights. And actually the Whyte fight was, 3 years ago now. But what we did see a couple of months ago was a very cautious and defensively responsible Joseph Parker, who ultimately in that fight, he wasn't busy enough to win a lot of rounds. He wasn't able to let his hands go enough, and he never really emptied his tank. Or actually, he never really troubled Joshua to any great extent. Sure, he landed a few decent punches here and there, but it wasn't enough. And Joshua, he fought a very smart fight strategically, and he didn't let Joseph Parker into it like the way that Parker would have liked to. But in the same breath, Parker, he just didn't have enough aggression. There wasn't enough ambition on the offensive front from Parker. His corner was telling him what he needed to do and how he needed to do it, but he just wasn't able to execute. And sure, the ref didn't help, but it did affect both fighters, and we have to remember that. It wasn't all against Joseph Parker. So I do agree in part with Higgins. So Parker, he definitely needs to be in the same kind of shape that he was in for Anthony Joshua against Dillian Whyte, and he needs to be as good defensively, because that will be in his favour. But his offensive output, it has to be more. And the aggression and ambition to go after Whyte, it needs to be much better than it was for the Joshua fight. I think that's just, a simple fact that if he's fighting away from home and just trying to box smart on the back foot, sort of, stick and move, that sort of thing, and he's hoping to win close rounds, it's not going to be enough. That is not going to win the fight in the UK. He actually needs to put it on Whyte at different points in the fight. He needs to win some rounds decisively. And I'm not just saying that he needs to stand in front of Whyte and unload, because standing in front of Whyte's going to suit Whyte right down to the ground. But there needs to be a better blend of offense and aggression in his game plan. I mean, who knows, there probably was that in that last game plan, but for whatever reason, Joshua was able to nullify what Parker was throwing at him. And it was positive in David Higgins' comments that Parker, he's already in top shape, because he needs to be. He came in needing to lose a lot of weight, about 30 pounds for that Joshua fight. Came into camp, I believe it was about 266, 267, weighed in at 236. And you don't want the weight issue coming into a big and important fight to become a distracting factor. So, from that standpoint, it's good that Parker is already in tip-top shape, so he can focus on the things that he actually needs to focus on instead of just focusing on fitness and weight loss. So now I'm expecting, because of David Higgins' comments, that he better turn up in, quote, formidable shape. And we know his main sparring partner for this upcoming fight is going to be Malik Scott. And Scott was also at the same event, and he was interviewed as well. So he was adamant that outside of the champions, this fight between Whyte and Parker is the best that can be made. And he noted Dillian Whyte is one of the strongest body punchers in the entire heavyweight division. So I think judging from that, you can imagine that they'll be looking at ways in camp to try and nullify that strength of Whyte's. And actually, as an aside, David Tua, he was also interviewed between fights, and he was asked about the Parker performance against Joshua, whether Parker had a good game plan. And his response was, it wasn't the right game plan because he didn't win, but he did the best he could. I guess that's a very simple way to sort of sum it all up. But on this talk by Higgins of a potential rematch with Anthony Joshua, potentially in October next year, if Parker beats Whyte, instinctively, I think it sounds a bit optimistic, especially given Joshua is likely going to be tied up with Deontay Wilder and also his mandatories, because if he doesn't face his mandatories, he's going to get stripped of his belts. But then part of me thinks the Parker vs. Whyte fight, it was actually made out of nowhere. We didn't see it coming. So then I think, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't bet against a potential rematch in October next year, because, anything can and does happen in boxing, apparently. But clearly a good win for either Parker or Whyte. It does put them back in the conversation for a fight at the top level with one of the champions, Anthony Joshua, a rematch down the line. I mean, right now, just not enough certainty around what could happen in the division more broadly to say when or if it could happen or will happen. And just on the comment that the winner will effectively go to number one in the rankings, because you take out Alexander Povetkin, he's the current number one, he's waiting on a title shot in the WBA as the mandatory challenger. That brings me to the next issue, the WBO. World Boxing News had sought confirmation from WBO President Paco Valcárcel about the status of this July 28th fight between Dillian Whyte and Joseph Parker. Because remember, Eddie Hearn and David Higgins, they made this fight without anything being on the line. They were calling it the People's Eliminator when it was announced. But Hearn, he has been petitioning the WBO to award the fight some sort of status, become a final eliminator or something similar. But the WBO president, he's told World Boxing News, please be advised the WBO does not sanction interim championships except under extraordinary circumstances, which currently are not present in the heavyweight division. So I've seen this news described elsewhere as a blow to the fight, that, this is a sort of, a knock and, perhaps they shouldn't have made this fight without having some more certainty. I'm not really sort of too fussed about what's happening here, because it was always a risk that the WBO wouldn't fall into line. And we know a prime motivation to make this fight was to essentially ensure big paydays for the two respective fighters. And at the end of the day, if you look at it, it's the WBO number 2 taking on the WBO number 6. So from that standpoint, it's already a meaningful fight. And it will ensure the winner is right in the mix, especially in the WBO, for if and when Alexander Povetkin gets his title shot in the WBA. So I don't really see it as a massive issue, because it was already a risk anyway. It was a known risk. But, and if they keep winning, there's always going to be decent fights out there for them, especially if they're waiting on a big title shot with Anthony Joshua. I think Whyte is more likely to be in line for a title shot at some point because he's in the same stable. But that may not be for a couple of years yet, and he's got to keep fighting to, one, earn some money, and two, for fans to actually believe in him and to sort of build that rematch up anyway. So he's going to have to take, Whyte that is, decent fights. And Parker, if he wants to get back to a title, is going to have to take decent fights too. But yeah, what do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.